Yeah, today, 19th May, we continue to get news from Ukraine, from the battlefields in Ukraine, pointing an ever grimmer picture for Ukraine. And we also get a sense that the domestic situation in Ukraine itself is becoming increasingly fraught and very bad. Further afield, there continue to be rumblings and repercussions from the Putin Xi summit in Beijing of a few days ago. Let's first of all talk about the battlefield situation in Ukraine. And given how extensive the front line is, and given that we're now talking about a Russian offensive on a very broad front, it's perhaps difficult to discuss every single battle that is taking place, but we can summarize the overall situation very simply. The Russians are advancing in every location. There are places where the Ukrainians are putting up more of a resistance than they are in other places, but overall, the Russians are now absolutely fully advancing. They're advancing in every single part of the contact line. They're putting pressure on the Ukrainians, and of course, if they're going to start a new offensive in Sumy region at some point over the next couple of days or weeks, for all we know, then what is already a very critical situation for Ukraine is going to become a catastrophic one. To add further to the overall picture, the grim overall picture, I want to repeat a point which I have made previously, which is that in most places, most of the fighting continues to be undertaken by forces that have been gathering in the Ukraine combat area throughout the period of the last 2.5 years that the war has been ongoing. The Russians have still not committed most of the big reserves that they are piling up in their rear areas within Russia itself. So, as I've discussed already, in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area, most of the military units are based upon former units of the Donbass militia, integrated into the Russian army, re-equipped and reorganized as military units of the Russian army, heavily retrained and now officered by Russian troops, but still, from what I can see, largely based on men conscripted in Donbass. Elsewhere in Chasov Yar, the fighting has been conducted, again, from what I can tell, largely by paratroop forces, the 98th Airborne Division, and other units that basically are the same units that took over after the Wagner forces were withdrawn en masse from the Chasov Yar Bakhmut area roughly a year ago. Again, they've been reinforced by other Russian units, and I gather that some of the Wagner troops have returned to this area, but mostly we're talking about Russian units, obviously rotated, obviously re-equipped and refreshed at various times, but Russian units that have been in this general area of Bakhmut and Chasov Yar for the better part of a year. I get the same sense about Rabotino, the Vremivka salient area, where the Russians are now fighting in both of the two villages of Staromayorsk and Rozhanye that the Ukrainians fought so bitterly to capture in the summer of last year. Again, most of the troops there, or at least most of the units there, are drawn from the same units that were already there roughly a year ago. The one place where I think one can speak of entirely new formations, or at least military units that have not participated in a big way in the special military operation in the past. The one place where we can see those is in Kharkiv area, where most of the troops seem to be motorized rifle brigades or perhaps divisions drawn from the Leningrad military district commanded by General Lapin. These, in other words, are proper line infantry from the Russian army. And of course, they've entered the battle. They're contract troops. I should make it clear they're not conscripts, despite what some people in the West still like to say. But these are line troops drawn from the Leningrad military district. General Lapin is the head of the Leningrad military district, and he is also simultaneously the commander of Group of Forces North, which is the force that is conducting the fighting in Kharkiv. Now, what is going to happen if and when the Russians do start to commit the hundreds of thousands of troops that they have been training and equipping, often in central Russia? We simply cannot say. But it seems that even with the forces that they have, the Russians probably now outnumber the Ukrainian forces on the battlefronts. Now, I say that we're getting a lot of confusing information about the precise size of the Ukrainian army, but there was a very, very sad and indeed distressing message on its Telegram channel from the semi-dissident Ukrainian Telegram channel Legitimy. They said that the Ukrainian authorities, their focus at the moment is to conscript as many men as possible, and given the disasters on the battlefronts and the ongoing Russian offensive, to throw them into the battle as quickly as possible, so that many of the soldiers who are being conscripted, many of the men who are being conscripted, some of them very young, some of them much older, that they're being sent into the battle with minimal training, and that the Ukrainian authorities understand and are aware of this, but they remain determined to go on resisting, and they're prepared to sacrifice large numbers of soldiers, large numbers of troops, by sending poorly trained, or in some cases barely trained, men into battle. Now, that was said by Legitimy. Now, this may be true, it probably is true, and we're starting to get reports that some Ukrainian cities have become almost deserts. So that there was a report which I saw yesterday from the southern industrial city of Zaporozhye, one of the major industrial centers of Ukraine, a big city built up in the Soviet era with a population of well over 1 million. It was a major center, major industrial center. This is where the Mortosich factory and design office, which was responsible for building gas turbines and aircraft engines, was located. It's also where the ZAZ motor vehicles or volume car that the Soviet Union was producing in the 1960s. This is where it too was being built. Anyway, it's a major urban and industrial center, and that there are reports, and I've seen film, which show in daylight the city is practically deserted, as if all of its people have left. And it's been suggested that this is largely a reflection of the ongoing mobilization process, that people frightened of being conscripted into the army, the men being frightened of conscripted into the army, are leaving en masse, either fleeing into the countryside or perhaps trying to flee Ukraine. But I wonder whether also over and above the question of the mobilization, there is general fear in places like Zaporozhye, apparently other cities too. Dnipro is another, apparently, which is going through the same process. Whether there is now a growing sense that with the situation very bad, with the Russians having recaptured Rabotino and advancing north, possibly towards Orechov, that before long, perhaps sometime in the autumn, the battle for Zaporozhye city itself might begin, and that more and more people don't want to be in Zaporozhye when that happens. Who knows? Anyway, the fact that cities in Ukraine, and apparently it's not just Zaporozhye, as I said, or Dnipro, it's apparently becoming a general characteristic, are empty, is obviously a catastrophic sign, if it is true. I can't obviously provide statistics for it, and at the moment, the evidence that it's taking place at all is anecdotal. Though from Zaporozhye, the evidence is very strong. I understand Kherson city, it's the same as well. Likely, it's true of of Dnipro also, but obviously I'm not physically present in any of these cities, so I can only take this information from what I hear and see, and from especially the film that is appearing. But one thing is indisputable, and that is that there has been a major protest by what might be described as organized labor in Ukraine over the last couple of days. And this is that Ukrainian truckers have apparently blockaded the roads between Odessa and cities, Ukrainian cities to the east. Now, this is, of course, a serious matter because Odessa is not only Ukraine's only functioning port, so Ukraine needs to be able to access Odessa if it is to conduct external trade. But it is also, Odessa is also, it's clear to me, a major center for receiving equipment, military equipment and supplies from the West. And obviously, those supplies have to be transferred by road and rail to the battlefronts from Odessa. So if the truckers are blockading the roads, then of course from Odessa, then that is of course a serious matter. Now, there have been protests, many protests in Ukraine before. I remember that there were significant protests in Ukraine, largely by the women folk of serving soldiers in the spring and summer of 2022. Then those protests faded away after the successful Ukrainian offensives or counteroffensives of the autumn of 2022. Recently, those types of protests have resumed again. They've now taken an extra dimension as a result of protests, some violent, some scattered, but some more than just scattered, as the new mobilization law and mobilization practices have bitten, with sometimes angry confrontations between Ukrainian civilians and recruitment officers. But to the best of my knowledge, this protest by the truckers is the first protest by organized labor. And it seems that the truckers are protesting specifically against the mobilization law. They're also deeply critical of President Zelensky. They're calling into question his legitimacy as president after his constitutional term ends on the 21st of this month. At least that's the report I've seen. And, well, but perhaps gets some sense that these truckers are not just protesting Zelensky's retention of the presidency and the mobilization law, but that they're also calling for a fundamental change of course, which might perhaps mean peace negotiations with the Russians. I don't want to overstate the importance of this protest. It's, as I said, a first protest by organized labor. If protests like this start to happen more often, if they spread, if they result in mass organized protests by workers across Ukraine, then of course we're looking at a crisis. In fact, a crisis rather similar to the one which struck Imperial Russia in February 1917, when workers in the capital in St. Petersburg went on strike, and when the military refused the government's orders to disperse those protests and break those strikes. But we're not there yet. I get the sense that the government, Zelensky's government, is still in control. Attempts to organize protests in Ukraine in the past have not been successful. The security services in Ukraine, the SBU, and the various far-right militias can probably still be counted upon to stifle these protests. So I don't want to overstate the importance of this. I'm not suggesting that Ukraine is as yet in a revolutionary or even a pre-revolutionary situation. But nonetheless, this is the first big organized protest by what might be called organized labor, and it might be a sign of things to come. I suspect that the officials in Kiev are concerned about it and are going to try to do whatever they can to make sure that it doesn't continue for very much longer. Anyway, that's the mood in Ukraine. There are lots of reports that the mood in the army is now also very bad, that most of the soldiers now in the army, around 80%, are recently mobilized conscripts, that they lack the motivation of the men who were conscripted in 2022, or of the soldiers who were already in the military before the special military operation began. We also hear that the officers and the NCOs, most of them, have died or been incapacitated or wounded over the course of the war, which of course must also dilute and weaken the control of the army, both control in battlefield situations and probably political control as well, just saying. But it's difficult again to get a complete picture of this. In most places, Ukrainian soldiers still seem to be fulfilling their orders, still seem to be fighting, but I am seeing more and more reports of more and more surrenders by Ukraine across the battlefronts. But again, it's difficult to put a number on this or to get a sense of whether this is developing into a trend. So what exactly has been happening on the battlefronts? Well, let's start with Kharkiv region. Firstly, Kharkiv, the Ukrainians have now concentrated most of the forces that they've rushed to the Kharkiv region. They're concentrating them to try to hold the village of Lipsy. And it's not difficult to understand why. Lipsy is halfway between the border and Kharkiv city. Putin has, of course, just said that Kharkiv city is not an immediate objective. The Russians have no plan for now to capture Kharkiv city. Most analysts agree that the Russian forces in the area are not configured for the moment to capture Kharkiv, and there's simply not enough of them. But anyway, the Ukrainians, anxious to hold on to Lipsy, worried that if Lipsy comes under Russian control, the Russians will be significantly closer to Kharkiv and will be within tube artillery range of Kharkiv. They'll be able to shell any part of Kharkiv that they wish with their artillery. Of course, they can already attack any part of Kharkiv they wish with their rockets and missiles. And of course, the Russian Air Force has recently begun bombing particular positions in Kharkiv city. And drones, Russian drones, can also reach pretty much any part of Kharkiv city as well. But if Lipsy falls, we'll be back basically to the situation we were in 2022, when the Russians are parked just outside Kharkiv city. They have their artillery well within range. They're able to launch fire attacks on Ukrainian positions in Kharkiv city. Now, there is an important difference between the situation today and in 2022. In fact, there are many differences, but I'm going to just highlight one, and it's not original to me. A well-known Russian reporter from the battlefronts, who I believe his actual name is Kotz, but who writes as older than Eddie, older than the Edders, the Icelandic tales. Anyway, the Norse tales. Anyway, this person is contrasting the situation in Kharkiv region with the one which existed in 2022. And he points out that despite the fact that Ukrainian resistance has been disorganized along the border, that the Russians were rapidly able to capture a string of villages across the border. In fact, the resistance from the Ukrainians has been much greater this time than it was in 2022. They are defending Volchansk and they are defending Lipsy, which in 2022 were empty of Ukrainian troops. All Ukrainian troops at that time were concentrated inside Kharkiv itself. But in other respects, the situation has changed and has shifted to the Russians' advantage. In 2022, the Russians advanced, if that's the right word. Anyway, they drove into Ukraine in long armored columns, moving at very high speed along Ukrainian roads, often, it must be said, against very limited opposition. The Ukrainian army was not yet organized to resist them. And this is why the Russians were able to capture, or appeared to have captured, so much territory so fast in 2022. But of course, this approach meant that when the Ukrainians did actually start to organize, the Russians found that they were essentially caught in various salients, that the roads that they were driving along were easily cut by Ukrainian infantry and artillery, and that the various parts of the Russian military were constantly at risk of attack and of encirclement. And anyway, this caused the Russians many losses and forced them into retreats in all kinds of places. Now, I think, again, it's important not to overstate this. As I remember, despite much publicity about the attacks on the Russians that the Ukrainians were organizing in February and March 2022, overall, they successfully consolidated themselves on the positions that they did occupy. But anyway, this time it's different. We're no longer seeing armored columns move rapidly across the landscape. Ukrainian resistance is too organized for that. This time, the Russians, on the contrary, advance after very heavy artillery and drone and airstrikes, with light infantry first, capturing positions, and then the armored columns, the armor follows behind. So it's a slower, more painstaking, more calculated, more carefully organized and operated advance than before against stiffer resistance. But anyway, this reporter, older than the air does, he also says that the Russians have immeasurably better reconnaissance and understanding of the situation than they did in 2022, whereas they had very few drones operating in 2022. Now the sky is full of Russian drones. I read somewhere, by the way, that the Russians now manufacture something like 100,000 drones a month, and that they're able to send reconnaissance drones and all kinds of kamikaze drones operating across the battlefields, and in some cases far behind Ukrainian front lines. He didn't mention the fact, but the Russians also now have a significant satellite array, also observing Ukrainian positions, not just in the immediate area of the battlefronts, but well behind the battlefronts as well. And of course, the Russian Air Force is far more active than it was in 2022. In 2022, Ukraine had a formidable air defense system based mainly on S-300, the Soviet-era S-300 systems. This time round, that air defense system has largely collapsed. The Western supplied air defense system is patchy and probably inferior in many respects in its component parts to the one that replaced it. In any event, overall, Ukrainian defenses, air defenses today, are a shadow of what they were in 2022. So the result is that the Russians are able to roam the skies, attack Ukrainian positions, provide close air support and air cover to their forces in a way that was not possible in 2022. And this reporter also says that Russian command and control systems are of a entirely different order of quality from what they were in 2022, whereas in 2022 it might take several hours before the Russians were able to act on reconnaissance data about the presence of Ukrainian troops in any particular location. Now, Russian artillery and aircraft are fully integrated into the command and control system, and they're able to respond within seconds to the detection by the various reconnaissance means, satellites, drones, or whatever, to information about the presence of Ukrainian troops and positions in any particular location. And by the way, you can see the evidence of that every day in the Russian Defense Ministry's updates. Every day we have information pouring out from the Defense Ministry, itemizing more and more artillery pieces that the Russians are destroying. The Russians seem to be on a campaign to basically take apart, to dismantle Ukraine's artillery park, and they seem to be making significant progress in achieving that. So Ukraine increasingly short of guns as well as shells. Anyway, that's a general picture, but what's actually happening on the ground? Well, despite the fact that the Ukrainians have concentrated so many troops in Lipsy, and perhaps I should say, when I talk about concentrations, apparently there are two complete brigades in Lipsi, which is a village, not a city or a town. But anyway, there are apparently two complete brigades there, but also large numbers of bits and bobs of other units reassigned to this area from various parts of the front lines. Despite that, it seems that the Russians are gradually making progress in Lipsi. It's difficult to get a complete sense of what precisely is happening, but I understand that the Russians are gradually encroaching on Lipsi, both from the north and from the east. And it's likely that when large numbers of troops are deployed in a relatively small area, often from various different units, that the Ukrainian defenses in Lipsi, despite the presence of large numbers of troops there, well, it's probable that they're not fully under cover, and that, of course, makes them very vulnerable to Russian artillery and airstrikes. Now, I have seen reports that the Ukrainians have also concentrated some of their best troops to try to hold the Russians back in Lipsi. Some of their special forces units, for example, are there. They're up against, by the way, Russian line infantry, motorized rifle brigades, as I said, drawn from the Leningrad military district. So some of the best Ukrainian troops are fighting to try to hold back and advance from, well, I'm not going to say average Russian infantry, but perhaps more plausibly typical Russian infantry. And again, the fact that the Ukrainians are having to throw into battle in precisely this area so many of their most elite infantry, their special forces, some of their best, some of the men drawn from their best brigades, on the one hand shows how important Lipsi is judged to be by the Ukrainian command, but it also, I think, has to show the extent to which, again, Ukraine is short of trained reserves. It makes no sense to deploy such a disproportionate number of your elite infantry to defend a single village, however important that village might appear to be. Now, a couple of days ago, the 79th Brigade, which is a Ukrainian brigade which has been defending positions in Novomikhailovka and Paraskovivka and Konstantinovka in the Vuglidar area near Marinka. Some of their troops were redeployed to precisely this area. And they said on their website, 79th Brigade said on their website, that the Ukrainian command had made a decision to abandon Volchansk and Lipsi and to establish a proper fortified line immediately to the north of Kharkiv. In other words, to return to the fortified lines which had existed in 2022. So, what has changed? Why are the Ukrainians suddenly defending Lipsi in this disproportionate way, overinvesting units to defend a single village, sending much of their best infantry to defend Lipsi? How does this make any kind of sense? Well, I'm going to explain what I think has happened. A couple of days ago, Zelensky himself came to Kharkiv and he met with all the military commanders and he met with all the senior officials there. I believe General Syrski himself was present. And as night follows day, so it seems to me, and consistent with President Zelensky's usual behavior, he seems to have rejected any idea of withdrawals from Lipsy or Volchansk. He seems to have insisted that these two places, Lipsy and Volchansk, must be defended, and defended at all costs. And in Lipsy, that exactly appears to be what is happening. It's logical in terms of Zelensky's behavior, previous behavior, to assume that this order has come from him, and we see the effect that it's having as it's being implemented. The Ukrainians have managed to slow the Russian advance down in Lipsy, but because of the enormous preponderance of firepower that the Russians have, they've not been able to stop it entirely. And in the meantime, they're sacrificing more of their best units and best men to defend a village which, according to the 79th Brigade, just a couple of days ago, they decided that they would retreat from. It's difficult to understand a lot of this decision making. And I have to say, it's also difficult to understand Zelensky's own thinking by this point. As I said, I'm assuming that this decision was made by Zelensky. One would have thought that by this point in the war, he would have understood that this policy of defending every village, every hamlet in this, I would say, fanatical way, that all it is doing is playing directly into the hands of the Russians, enabling the Russians to carry out more aggressive attrition on the Ukrainian military, which is, of course, exactly what is happening in Lipsy. Anyway, Lipsy is being defended in this way. Interestingly, Volchansk, which arguably, given that the Russians are not planning, apparently, to capture Kharkiv at this time. Volchansk, by contrast, a much bigger place, arguably a more important place, because the capture of Volchansk could have an impact on developments further south in Kupiansk, Izium, Balakleya, and all of those sort of places. The same pattern of defending is not apparently being followed by the Ukrainians in Volchansk. Reports yesterday and this morning appear to confirm that the Ukrainians have completely pulled back from all of Volchansk north of the Volcha River. The Russians are securely in control of that entire area. There's apparently pictures which confirm the fact, showing the Russian troops moving in the northern part of Volchansk, apparently unafraid of Ukrainian attacks. The Ukrainians have sent troops to Volchansk, but the supply roads, the roads into Volchansk, are apparently being attacked by the Russians, are under the fire control of the Russians. So it's difficult for the Ukrainians to move much equipment or supplies along these roads. And lots of reports that the Russians have crossed the Volcha River in at least two places. One immediately on the western side of Volchansk, one on the eastern side of Volchansk. It is likely that Volchansk will be captured by the Russians fairly soon. So, again, I'm not obviously a military expert. I've said this many times now. But I would have thought that it would have made more sense, if you're going to defend anywhere at all, to defend Volchansk rather than Lipsy. Zelensky, probably terrified of a Russian advance on Kharkiv, of losing Kharkiv itself, has insisted that Lipsy must be held, and the result is that the Ukrainians are slowing the Russians in Lipsy, even as they're about to lose Volchansk and are suffering horrific losses in the process. Well, that's the situation in Kharkiv region. We'll have to wait and see how things play out, but I suspect that the Russians eventually are going to capture Lipsy, despite all of this fierce Ukrainian resistance, and Volchansk looks like it's essentially a done thing. Now, elsewhere along the front lines, things are heating up and getting worse and worse for Ukraine. Big news over the last few hours has been in Chasov Yar. The Russians have been carrying out a storming operation in the micro-district. Their forces entered the micro-district from various directions. There's evidence that they've captured now. There's photographic and film evidence of the Russians having captured several large buildings within the micro-district. Intense fighting is taking place in the micro-district, even as the Russians simultaneously push towards the canal in the north from Bogdanovka through the village of Kalinovka, and have established secure positions along the canal to the south. I suspect that the Russians will be working to cross the canal and to attack the main part of Chasov Yar from the north and the south as soon as the micro-district itself is cleared. Now, I mentioned Zelensky yesterday. Zelensky gave another one of his speeches, summaries about the situation on the battlefronts. He said that all the Russian attacks on the micro-district had been repelled, that the Ukrainians had counterattacked in the micro-district, that they'd recaptured all the ground that they'd lost, and that the Russians had been pushed out of the micro-district. Well, it is not impossible, and I have no evidence to contradict him. All I will say is that there is abundant evidence, film and photographic evidence, of the Russians entering the micro-district in force, occupying large tracts of it, places in it. I've seen no evidence, as of the time of making this program, that any part of the micro-district has been recaptured by Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians have made all kinds of claims of successful counterattacks in all sorts of places in the past. I remember, for example, way back in 2022, they claimed to have carried out a successful counterattack in Severodonetsk, even as that town was coming completely under Russian control. They made all kinds of similar claims of successful counterattacks in Bakhmut. At one point, I remember General Syrskyi claimed that the whole of Bakhmut had been brought under Ukraine's fire control and that the Russian troops there had been effectively, essentially encircled. What I suspect is happening is that Zelensky's not getting the complete information about what's going on in Chasov Yar. He visited Chasov Yar a few weeks ago. He apparently again gave orders that Chasov Yar must be defended no matter what. I suspect the local commanders are, to some extent at least, hiding from him the truth. They're probably reporting more positive outcomes of the battle of the micro-district than Zelensky himself is saying. And I have to say, given that the Russians basically have encircled the micro-district, I, for one, as a non-military person, cannot see how, even if one allows for the fact that the Ukrainian troops in the micro-district are highly motivated and determined and which appears to be the case. Apparently, again, Ukraine deployed many of its best troops to Chasov Yar. Even allowing for that fact, I'm not really sure how they would be able to conduct a successful counteroffensive, counterattacks, in an area where they are in effect surrounded. Having said that, I want to reiterate again, I'm not at the location itself. I can't say exactly what has happened. Maybe it will turn out that for once Zelensky is telling the truth and that the Ukrainians have successfully counterattacked and again driven the Russians back out of the micro-district. Now, let's assume that happens. Likelihood is that both sides, over the course of that kind of fighting, will have suffered significant losses. The Russians can replace theirs. The Ukrainians can't. The troops in the micro-district are cut off from resupply and reinforcement. All that it will mean is that the fight for the micro-district has been prolonged at the sacrifice of more brave men's lives. Again, successful counterattack. To what purpose exactly? Well, no doubt Zelensky could come up with all sorts of explanations of what the purpose is, maybe improving Ukraine's prospects in advance of the peace conference, still referred to as a peace conference, that's going to happen in a few weeks in Switzerland. Maybe that's his latest excuse. But all I will say is, if there has been a counterattack in the micro-district, a successful one, which is at this moment in time, I strongly doubt, well, if there has been, it's another exercise in futility and another pointless sacrifice of the lives of brave men. So that's Chasov Yar. Elsewhere, many more Russian advances in the Kupiansk area. The Russians now seem to be advancing and capturing, or at least attacking, villages on the way to both the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. I remember how a few weeks ago there were lots of claims about a successful Ukrainian counterattack in the Terny area on the Zherebets river. If that counterattack ever happened on any kind of scale, it's clear that it's completely petered out, and the Russians seem to be pushing hard now, and I do emphasize hard, they do seem to be now intent on reaching both the Oskol and the Zherebets rivers. I'm not going to go through all of the reports of all the battles in all of these villages. There's plenty of other places you can find that. The Military Summary Channel, Slavyangrad, Riba, all of these people provide all kinds of updates. I'm not going to go spend all my time going through all of those. And in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area, important new development. The Russians have now begun bombing and shelling the settlement of New York. It actually does have that name. The Russians have a different name for it, by the way, but the Ukrainians call it New York, located to the west of the Russian-controlled small city of Gorlovka, which the Russians, by the way, captured all the way back in 2014. It was, to be more precise, it was part of the original insurrection in Donetsk in 2014 and has never been recaptured by Ukraine. Anyway, New York now bombed, shelled, and to my mind, that suggests that with the Russians having cleared the fields between Novoalexandrovka and Arkhangelskoye, north of Ocheretino, they're likely to be advancing towards Novoalexandrovka quite soon, but more importantly, they're probably going to start pushing now northwestwards capturing the villages along the H20 highway and threatening the Ukrainian troops in New York and Toretsk, opposite Gorlovka, with eventual encirclement. So, a critical situation for the Ukrainians there also. And elsewhere, in Krasnogorovka, it seems that the Russians have been clearing the 90% of Krasnogorovka, the north and eastern parts of Krasnogorovka, from which the Ukrainians withdrew about a week ago. That they're now completing the process of clearing the Ukrainians from these places. But importantly, even as we're getting more reports that the Russians are now also completing the operation of clearing Netailevo village, a little to the northwest of Krasnogorovka, and also Yasnobrodovka, yet another village immediately to the north of Netailevo, that the Russians apparently are deploying troops immediately north of Krasnogorovka and are moving towards cutting the supply lines to the remaining Ukrainian troops concentrated in the northwestern part of Krasnogorovka. Those Ukrainian troops, also being now heavily bombed and shelled by the Russians. And I saw a report that the Russians have actually destroyed a bridge along that very same road, which will interrupt Ukrainian supply lines and logistics even more. Yet again, we see a further example of what is happening, because it looks as if the Russians might be working towards encircling the remnants of the Ukrainian garrison in Krasnogorovka, which once more begs the question of why, since Krasnogorovka has been in effect lost for at least 2 weeks now, the Ukrainians have continued to keep troops in this area of Krasnogorovka rather than withdraw them from there. As I said some time ago, the moment Pervomaisky fell to the north of Krasnogorovka, it became a certainty that Krasnogorovka would fall. The map, to me, makes that obvious. I would have thought a retreat from Krasnogorovka would be the obvious thing to do. No, again, the Ukrainians remained where they were, and now there's a real risk that they're going to be surrounded. I suspect that before that happens, someone in the Ukrainian command system, probably a local officer, will make the obvious decision and will decide to pull the troops out and will probably make up some story to satisfy Zelensky and his senior officers in Kiev. At least, I hope that's what happens. And last but not least, there's lots of reports now that in the Novomikhailovka area, with many of the best units of the 79th Brigade, which is of the Ukrainian army, which has been defending in this area, having been withdrawn and redeployed to Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians are now in effect admitting that the Russians have broken through. Apparently, much of Paraskovievka has now been captured, but more importantly, perhaps, the Russians have now taken positions to the southwest of the next village, Konstantinovka. It looks as if Konstantinovka could also soon be captured, or at least attacked. And anyway, one way or the other, the Russians are close to the road leading from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar in the south. Now, this road has been one of the main supply roads for Vuhledar for some time. I cannot believe, given how close the Russians have been to it for some time now, that this road is still in use to any great degree. But for what it's worth, the Russians are close to cutting it. And of course, if they capture Konstantinovka, given that they've also apparently captured or almost captured the other village of Georgievka close to the north, immediately to the north, that would put them in a position where they can advance from multiple directions towards the town of Kurakovo. They're already now very close to Kurakovo, but once Krasnogorovka falls, they can advance towards Kurakovo from Krasnogorovka. They can march on Kurakovo from Georgievka through Maximilianovka. They can also, once Konstantinovka falls, advance on Kurakovo from Konstantinovka as well. All the supply roads to Vuhledar at that point, all the main ones, get cut. I understand there's still one supply road left to Pavlograd, but the Russians are dangerously close to that road as well, from positions to the south of Vuhledar. It looks to me as if at that point, Vuhledar would be operationally encircled. And again, the Ukrainians would have no realistic option but to withdraw or to allow their troops in Vuhledar to be trapped and encircled, much in the way that Ukrainian troops eventually found themselves encircled in Mariupol back in 2022. In other words, an actual cauldron would develop, a real trap, a proper siege, one from which it would be impossible for Ukrainian troops to retreat from. I'm going to guess, by the way, that again Zelensky is going to do that which he always does, which is try to defend in Vuhledar for as long as possible. And whilst I think it's likely that some officer or other will pull the troops out of Krasnogorovka before they're encircled, given how important Vuhledar is, I would have thought this would be a more difficult thing to pull off there, to pull troops out without telling Zelensky about it. And I think it's not impossible that at some point in the next month, 6 weeks or so, we could actually see a genuine, real cauldron finally emerge around Vuhledar, with the entire garrison there, not just operationally encircled, but properly encircled as well. Anyway, terrible situation for Ukraine in every part of the line of contact, and Ukrainian losses, as I understand it, still running at well over 1,000 men, dead and wounded, every single day, even as the mobilization process continues and stutters along without much prospect, or so it seems to me, of changing the situation on the battlefronts. Well, have the Ukrainians anything to cheer about? Well, last night I heard reports of another major Ukrainian missile strike on Crimea. Maybe they're capitalizing on the destruction of the S-400 missile system in Belbek Air Base that took place some days ago. I don't have any information at all about this missile strike. We'll find out more about it within the next few hours, no doubt. I have had an explanation from someone who has, as I understand it, an Air Force background about some of the enigmas about the successful Ukrainian strike on the Belbek air base. Now, I want to stress this is not about how the ATACMS missile got through. As I've said, there's always a possibility in war that a missile will get through. No air defense system is completely impenetrable. But specifically, the mystery of why two MiG-31 fighter jets were at Belbek at the time when the airbase was attacked. This person has speculated that these were probably aircraft on patrol. One of them might have suffered some engine problem or other problem, and it had to land. And on the basis that these aircraft probably operate in pairs, for some reason maybe both of these fighter jets decided to land at Belbek for repairs to be done. Now, Crimea must be one of the most observed and surveyed places in the world. The friends of Ukraine, the Americans and the other NATO powers, have many eyes in the sky over and near and close to Crimea. They will have noticed the fact that these two MiG-31s were there, and they'll have relayed that information to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians reacted immediately by launching the missile strike on Belbek Air Base, which in the event did destroy these two aircraft. It's speculative, but it's plausible. This person has also confirmed the point to me that the Russians appear to have taken no step to create hardened shelters for their aircraft at Belbek Air Base. He's pointed out that the MiG-31s are huge aircraft and that they might not fit into standard hardened shelters anyway. So even if they'd been present, it might not have made a huge amount of difference. But he's also made what I think is an entirely valid point, which is that if the Russians are indeed hardening their air bases, which perhaps they are, then more likely than not, the bases which they would be working to harden as a priority are the ones in Krasnodar region, near Rostov, and in places like Belgorod and Kursk regions, which might be the more plausible targets for Ukrainian missile strikes. That is where it is in these bases that the bulk of Russia's air force, which is engaged in the special military operation, is concentrated. Anyway, a missile strike by Ukraine towards Crimea will no doubt get a number of reports about it before long. Let's move on and discuss a number of other topics. And the first is I have to mention an article by Mark Galeotti in the London Times discussing the shifts, the changes in the defense ministry, Shoigu's dismissal from the post of defense minister. Mark Galeotti, who has a reputation as being one of the best analysts in the West on Russian military matters, seems to have regarded this dismissal of Shoigu as Shoigu being sacked. I've already pointed out that self-evidently this is not the case, though Galeotti did point out in this very same article that the fact that Shoigu has played such a prominent role as Secretary of the Security Council in Putin's trip to Beijing, argues against that, and Galeotti then goes on to say that it might even be the case that as a more supple person, whatever that means, he might be a better national security advisor for Putin than his predecessor, the rigid, hardline, doctrinaire, anti-Westerner Nikolai Patrushev. For the record, Patrushev has not been sacked. He is now a presidential aide in the executive office. As I said, this is a senior position. I don't think Patrushev is quite the hardline doctrinaire figure that many people think he is. But anyway, there we are. The more interesting thing was what Galeotti said about the appointment of Andrei Belousov to the post of defense minister. He points out that Belousov is a civilian official, a planner, and a technocrat, and an immensely competent one. Well, Galeotti takes exactly the diametric opposite opinion of this appointment than the one I do. I suggested that the purpose of Belousov's appointment is to ensure that the civilian industry gets the full benefit of the big increase in activity and investment in the military-industrial complex. That Belousov's job is to integrate the military-industrial complex more effectively into the civilian economy, as has happened in the Soviet Union in the past, in order to strengthen the civilian economy through technology transfers and also by ensuring that the military-industrial economy plays its part in increasing the output also of civilian goods. Now, I was interested to see that Galeotti, however, as I said, takes it the other way around. He believes that the purpose of Belousov's appointment is to militarize the entire Russian industrial economy, to make it a permanent mobilization war economy as a whole. And I notice that this is now increasingly what is being said by more and more people in the West, that this is all a part of a plan by Putin to militarize the entire Russian industrial system, to convert Russia into a garrison state, to make its industry essentially a military, all of its civilian industries, part of the military industrial complex, to turn it into something like what many Westerners believe the Soviet Union became in the Cold War period. Well, and I've even seen some comparisons being made between Belousov and, of all people, Albrecht Speer, who was Germany's armaments minister in the second half of the Second World War, and who is often credited with putting the German economy onto a proper mobilization and war footing, and who is also credited with achieving an armaments miracle in Germany. By the way, there's a very fine history of this, a revisiting and review of Speer's supposed achievement by the British historian Adam Tooze, which to some extent um, refutes, or rather corrects, some of the claims that have been made about um, Speer's technocratic genius and his supposed success as armaments minister. But anyway, this is the parallel that is being made. Russia now placed on permanent war footing, extending far beyond the Ukraine war. Belousov appointed to make that possible, to not integrate the military-industrial complex into the civilian economy, but to absorb the civilian economy into the military-industrial complex. Well, a few things to be said. Firstly, only time will tell who is right about this, but I will make a number of observations quickly. Firstly, the military-industrial complex, military spending, according to Putin, accounts for 6.7% of GDP. So those who say that the entire civilian economy is going to be militarized are saying that the sector with just 6.7% of the economy is going to absorb the remaining 90%, which doesn't, on its face, seem very likely. But let's put that aside. We can always argue points and statistics, and arguments drawn from statistics are not always terribly sound. The first thing I would say is that there is absolutely nothing that Putin has said, or Belousov has said, or any Russian official has said, which actually corroborates this claim that the Russians are planning to put their economy on a permanent war footing, or that is the actual purpose of Belousov's appointment. On the contrary, Putin and Belousov himself and Peskov and other Russian officials have told us the exact opposite, the diametric opposite, which is that Belousov is being appointed to run the defense ministry in a way that will eventually strengthen the civilian economy. Not that he's there to transform the civilian economy into an adjunct of the military-industrial complex. You have to completely disregard everything that Putin and all the other Russian officials are saying in order to believe this increasingly fashionable view. But the second point I would make is, if that really was the plan, if placing the entire economy on a war footing really was the intention, is Belousov really the person you would appoint to do it? He has had some background in assisting the military-industrial complex. He's played an important role in developing drone technology, for example. He's obviously worked and knows military officials. And of course, as I explained at inordinate length previously, he has a background which makes him puts him close and in the tradition of the reformist tradition within the Soviet economic planning complex, the one identified with the former Soviet Prime Minister, Alexei Kosygin, for whom Belousov's father once worked, and with the economist, the famous Soviet economist, Yevsei Lieberman, who back in the early 1960s proposed certain very significant reforms to the Soviet economy, which were never implemented or never fully implemented, but which do seem to bear some resemblance to the economic model that we're seeing today. Well, as I said, Belousov does have that background, but he's never had any direct role, as far as I'm aware, in military industrial management. That is not his background. If you wanted to militarize the entire economy, surely you would appoint someone else, someone with more of that kind of background to take that sort of role. And maybe you wouldn't be looking at the defense ministry itself to make the big changes. Maybe the more likely place where you would go and seek to make your changes to would be the economics ministry itself, or perhaps possibly the key personalities of the civilian government. Surely a more appropriate person to militarize the entire economy would have been someone like, say, Alexei Dumin, if he'd been appointed First Deputy Prime Minister, or perhaps Sergei Chemezov, who is the head of Rostec, which in effect is the Russian military-industrial complex. If Chemezov or Dumin had been appointed First Deputy Prime Minister and placed in overall charge of the entire Russian economy, then I think you could make a plausible case that the militarization of the economy is indeed the plan. Of course, it ought to be said that both Chemezov and Dumin do have a background in developing the civilian side of the Russian economy, but they have hands-on experience of military industrial management. Just saying. And in that case, surely you would not appoint a person of Belousov's background to the defense ministry. You would again find someone like Dumin or Chemezov to put in charge of the defense ministry, or someone else like that. This theory, which, as I said, is now becoming the fashion across the Western commentariat, to my mind, makes absolutely no sense. It's contrary to what Putin has said, and it is not consistent with the nature of the appointments. Belousov is a planner, but he is a civilian, and he's the obvious person to put in charge of the defense ministry if you want to ensure that the defense ministry complex is going to support the civilian economy. He's not the person you would put in charge if you intended to militarize the entire economy instead. Just say. Anyway, there we are. All of these strange analyses and explanations of, in my opinion, simple things. It never ceases to astonish me how people pay no attention at all to what Russian leaders actually say, and instead come and impose their own theories upon their actions, sometimes shifting and cherry-picking their comments in order to support their arguments. I ought to say that again, I read article after article saying that Putin has made no secret of his plan, once Ukraine falls, to advance westwards into Europe. I've never seen a single statement of Putin's that supports that. On the contrary, he has gone out of the way repeatedly to rule it out. But that doesn't prevent people from saying it. I've seen it again, published again and again, in place after place, that Putin has quite openly announced his plan to subjugate the whole of Europe and to take it over, even though, as I said, there's no evidence in anything that Putin has ever said that he or any other official of the Russian government has those sorts of plans. And in addition, we also have these claims about Belarus coming up now. So you could see how a picture is being created. The Russians militarizing their economy, preparing for a long struggle with the West as they harbor these plans for the conquest of Europe. And we in the West must begin a massive program of rearmament and militarization to counter this threat. Nothing the Russians have done supports any part of that claim. What is true is that the Russians and the Chinese are coming much closer together. And as I've just said, there's been now increasing alarm and recognition in the West that this relationship between China and Russia is for real. And we've had articles now, like this one in the Financial Times, why growing China-Russia military ties worry the West. This, after years of hearing that this relationship was not for real, that the Russians and the Chinese have this deep hostility and suspicion of each other, that they are not really friends or anything of that kind. Well, I've never taken that view seriously. Russian-Chinese relations began in the 17th century. China and Russia have never fought a full-fledged war against each other, though they have the world's longest border. There were border clashes at the end of the 17th century, and there were border clashes briefly in the 1960s. But that's been about it. Overall, through the vast period of time, far and away the biggest period of time, Russian and Chinese relations have, well, until recently perhaps, they've not been especially close. They went through a very positive period in the 50s, and they're going through another very, very positive period again, but they've been cordial. That has actually been the most common pattern in the relationship between the Russians and the Chinese. But the most interesting thing that I saw in this huge article in the Financial Times about all of the enormous risks that these military ties between the Russians and the Chinese pose, these transfers of technology, the Chinese learning all kinds of things from the Russians about how to fight the Americans, about how the Russians might provide the Chinese with hypersonic technologies, and the Chinese might provide the Russians with AI technology, all of which is true, by the way. But anyway, the most interesting thing that I saw was this. Overland, just one simple, short sentence. Overland shipments of energy, food, and military goods from Russia could greatly blunt the effect of a US naval blockade on China. Whole of the rest of the article talks about other things. There's just that one long article, but it's just that one sentence. In fact, we know that going all the way back to Obama's time, a plan has existed in the United States for a naval blockade of China and the closing of the Straits of Malacca to Chinese ships. And obviously, one of the primary reasons why the Chinese are so interested in forging this close connection with the Russians is because the Russians can provide the Chinese with all of the energy, raw materials, including, by the way, lithium, if it's ever developed. Apparently, there are large lithium deposits in Russia. rare earths, all of those things, food, soybeans. Apparently, Russia doesn't produce many of those, but there's big plans to grow soybeans in Russia and in Central Asia as well, I understand. That the Chinese are looking to develop overland links to provide themselves with the raw materials they need so that this naval blockade ceases to have any effectiveness. I suspect that this is the single thing that worries the West, or at least the United States, most, because the plan the West, or at least the United States, has had to counter China has ultimately revolved around the option or plan of imposing a naval blockade on China. The obsession with detaching Russia from China has also, I suspect, been largely about this to deny China access to Russia's enormous resources. Well, the dismay that exists in Washington and in Western capitals is because that plan is now crumbling into dust. The fact that the threats of a blockade on China would have been one of the factors that caused the Chinese to look to the Russians, and the fact that the constant pressure on the Russians to detach from the Chinese and to weaken them by expanding NATO eastwards, and as we've now discovered, install nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that was what drove the Russians to the Chinese. Well, that, of course, is something that goes universally unacknowledged. It's the greatest failure of Western statescraft, certainly since the Versailles Treaty and arguably long before. I say Western statescraft. Does it exist anymore? I wonder. Anyway, on that thought, I'm going to end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.